Me, I trusted him.
Me, I loved him.
And me.
214 years after his death, he's one of the hottest founding fathers, thanks in large part to Lin-Manuel Miranda.
What's your name, man? Alexander Hamilton.
Hamilton, an American musical, has many of us looking at the man on the $10 bill a bit differently these days. But what about the other Hamilton in the show, with a smaller role but immense influence on Alexander's life and legacy?
Elizabeth Schuyler, it's a pleasure to meet you.
His wife, Eliza Schuyler Hamilton.
We had no notion of who Eliza Hamilton really was, other than what we saw in biographies and in the musical, of course. But we were surprised to find a very spunky kind of warrior lady.
That revelation, based on research trips and the analysis of more than 9,000 long letters.
Long letters, yes.
Alexander never takes 5 words to say what he might say in 50 words.
Between Alexander and Eliza Hamilton, their relatives and friends, had Stephanie Dray and Laura Kamoie excited, since spunky and warrior-like isn't exactly how Eliza's typically portrayed, even in the musical they both love.
A lot of the characterizations that exist of Eliza often focuses on her as this sort of very sweet, kind of meek, very loyal, saintly wife. We have a different kind of a characterization of Eliza in My Dear Hamilton.
Their book details a formidable founding mother who grew up the daughter of a general, was fiercely committed to America's independence, helped write many of Alexander Hamilton's most influential papers during their loving yet sometimes complicated marriage, had 8 children, and lived 97 years, rubbing elbows and making her opinion known with history's key players.
I mean, she knew 12 of the first 16 presidents. There were times that we were pretty sure that the Hamiltons knew literally every person that lived in early America because, we were constantly having new, interesting characters that could potentially be in the book, and we had to make the decision about who we would include and not include.
Even after those decisions, they had to cut 60,000 words from their first draft. That's 200 pages.
There were a lot that were very painful to cut. Yes. A lot of darlings, and is what you say in the writing world is cut your darlings. Well, we cut a lot of darlings, I would just want to say.
These co-authors discussed their favorite darlings.
You had to get rid of your Frenchmen.
I had to get rid of all these awesome Frenchmen.
And some of the reviews on their book, especially from a young critic.
She was quite mad at us that certain characters died, and I got all kinds of emojis about how mean we were for those deaths.
Plus, how an American history expert and an ancient world fiction writer teamed up to write not one, but 2 best-selling titles.
In our other writing, I would actually say that we have kind of dissimilar styles. So it was sort of with a great deal of hubris that we dove into this, and it's sort of magically, and we often sort of say, it was magical.
Hamilton-hungry fans and history buffs alike, this conversation is filled with entertaining.
Many times, yes. Stephanie cursed the Adams administration.
If we could sing it would be great.
And enlightening information.
It seems like in both of our novels that the crazier something is, the more likely it is to have been true.
Next, in this first-person one-on-one with Stephanie Dray and Laura Kamoie. Presented by St. Louis County Library and HEC TV.
First, I just want to welcome both of you to St. Louis.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're happy to be here.
Yeah, so we are at the historic Hanley House in Clayton, which was built in 1855, not too far off when Eliza Hamilton came through St. Louis in 1837.
1837, on her way to visit her son William in the Wisconsin Territory. That's right.
And what's so remarkable to me about hearing about that, I mean, it's really neat that she came through here, but she was 80?
Yes. She was 80.
In 1837. I mean, that's not an 80 in 2018. That's a different kind of 80, right?
She was a very intrepid lady, and she was athletic all of her life. Even up to her death, I think she was walking 2 miles a day in Washington.
Yeah.
Hamilton the musical. I mean, that's how most people are knowing Eliza Hamilton right now. Yes. And so this idea actually came after you two saw the musical?
Laura actually saw it first without me.
Oh.
I had another engagement.
I wanted her to come.
She did. And I knew that she loved it because my cell phone was blowing up all night and I was so tired I thought I'll just talk to her about whatever it is in the morning. And by the time we got in the taxi cab in the morning on the way to our publisher to talk about our first book, America's First Daughter, Laura was just vibrating with excitement, and she started telling me about Eliza Hamilton, and we had sort of had a niggling idea that we might want to approach Hamilton, but this really cemented it. By the time we got out of that cab, and it was not a long cab ride,
It was not.
we had decided that we had our next great untold American story.
Like I said, that's we know her kind of from the musical. Do you feel that there's anything about her that's misrepresented, or maybe that their relationship is a little misrepresented? And you kind of touched on some things about her.
One of the things about her portrayal in the musical, and we are both giant, nerdy, geeky fans of the musical. I mean, just there's no question about that. But I think that the relationship between Alexander and Angelica, her older sister, and Eliza, is portrayed in the musical in such a way that you maybe can get to the end and think, I wonder if he really should have been with Angelica all along. And maybe Eliza was sort of not his equal or his match, or his best match anyway.
Right.
And I think that is an altogether inaccurate representation of who Eliza was and what her relationship with Alexander was. It's really important, I think, for people to understand that in the real history, Angelica had already been married for several years by the time of that winter's ball, and she had several small children. So there was never sort of an option where she and Alexander would have ended up married, or there was never a moment where Angelica gave Alexander up for her younger sister. Instead, what we found is that Eliza, even before they were married, was inserting herself in politics, had very strong opinions. She was already a patriot. She was the daughter of a general. And so we have a different kind of a characterization of Eliza in My Dear Hamilton.
Well, in the research that you did, I mean, you became very familiar with both Alexander and Eliza. I read it was something like 9,000 Hamilton letters, right?
So for both the
Long Hamilton letters.
Yeah, long letters, yeah.
For both America's First Daughter and My Dear Hamilton, our starting point in terms of primary source material was the National Archives website, which has a section devoted to the Founding Fathers. And the really exciting thing about this collection of letters is that it is digitized and all the letters are transcribed, so it creates a searchable database. And there are almost 9,000 letters to and from Alexander Hamilton. And we thought this would represent a great savings in time from the Jefferson book, because there are 18,000 Jefferson letters on that same website, except that Alexander never takes 5 words to say what he might say in 50 words. And so there was actually no savings of time whatsoever.
So you have all this information on him. But for Eliza, how did you go about developing her voice? Because she famously burned her love letters, right, to Hamilton. Is that accurate?
We're not sure if she burned them or destroyed them in some other way. We know that they don't exist, and they don't exist in sort of a pattern, and that is that there are a few letters that have survived that were written in Eliza's hand, but these are letters that she sent other people and they preserved. The ones that she would have had in her own possession are gone, which indicates that she probably destroyed them.
Interesting. So then how did you go about finding her voice?
Oh gosh, I think we extrapolate from the letters that do survive, and you can start looking at what her friends and family say about her. We were sort of excited when we found a letter from her older sister, Angelica. Now, we don't know who Angelica was angry at in this letter, but she was angry with someone, and she believed that this person needed a dressing down, and she appears to have sent them to her younger sister, Eliza, and said, "Because you know how Mrs. Hamilton can be." And we were sort of taken aback, like, we don't know how Mrs. Hamilton can be. Please tell us. But it started us down on a path of looking for patterns that sort of fit that characterization and that voice.
What I find interesting is that you mentioned in the back of your book that Historically, I mean, this is a historical fiction, so the conversations you've come up with, but the crazy events that are in there, like these big events, you think there's no way that happened. No, those are the things that are historically accurate. Those are facts.
It seems like in both of our novels that the crazier something is, the more likely it is to have been true. We did not have to make things up to create drama in Eliza Hamilton's life. It was already there. She was at the forefront and a witness to many of the most important moments in the founding of the country.
Let's talk about one of those kind of what seemed, when you think back to that time, moments that seems a little crazy was President James Monroe coming to her house. And not to give anything away, but you bookend the book with this experience. In fact, I had to go back and reread the first chapter. I was like, wait a minute, I need to put this all together. Tell me about that.
So this incident is recounted by a descendant of the Hamiltons in an intimate portrait about Alexander Hamilton. So it comes down as a family story of what happened. And in this account, we learned that James Monroe paid call to Eliza Schuyler Hamilton. They were both very elderly when this encounter took place. He appears to have wanted to have some sort of reconciliation with her. She was not at all polite, and we will not give away any spoilers about what happened, but she was not intimidated by our fifth president. And the encounter, as described by her family, was a very curious one because it didn't really raise Alexander Hamilton at all through James Monroe's voice, which led us to wonder, why is he calling upon Eliza Hamilton? What is so special about her so long after Hamilton is dead that former presidents and founding fathers are calling upon her and trying to reconcile? And that really led us down an important path to discovering her story as a patriot in her own right.
And that was another moment when we looked at this encounter with James Monroe and said, this is not a shy, retiring, meek little lady. This is a little lady who squared off with a president, who laid out a demand, and who, stood her ground. And she would have personally benefited from making peace with James Monroe because it might have opened doors for her, many lawyer sons, and given her access maybe back into certain parts of society. It would have benefited her, but she was not going to have it given the things that had transpired between them.
Let's talk about some of the other ways that you kind of revealed things to yourselves. And some of that I read was part of your research trips, right? That you guys went together on some of these trips. And there was one trip, was it to Jockey Hollow, that changed kind of how you perceived their love relationship kind of beginning, right?
Yes. Our sort of original idea for how they would meet and fall in love was fairly lighthearted because that's how it's generally portrayed in the musical and in biographies. But when I went to Morristown, I went and I saw the house where they courted and I saw all the pretty lanes and the pretty church. And then I thought, I'm going to go into the hills where the soldiers were. And when I went there and I saw the conditions that our soldiers in the American Revolution were living in, and the sort of suffering that both Eliza and Alexander Hamilton would have witnessed and probably tried to help alleviate, I thought this was not the best place to have a lighthearted romance. People were starving and suffering, and it was cold. It was the coldest winter on record at the time. And so we decided that this was a pair of people who fell in love under distressing circumstances, and that sort of gave it a deeper level to their love story, and we were really excited about exploring it that way.
And it's part of our characterization in the book that their marriage, their relationship from the very first moments is forged in this crucible of war and politics. And they're always together side by side as they, go from one political moment to another. It also meant that war and political things were always very personal to them. And so that realization about the nature of how they come together that Stephanie helped us create from that trip to Morristown really was another piece in figuring out how we were going to talk about them as a couple throughout the course of the novel.
Speaking of her as a counterpart, there are these letters or documents of his that are written in her hand. Do you feel, since you know her so much better than many of us do you feel that she wasn't just taking note, writing down for him? Do you feel that she was intellectually stimulating? Was she questioning things? I mean, in the book, she is.
We know for sure from her own recollections as a much older lady that in recounting the story of Alexander writing George Washington's farewell address, which was a very famous political document at the time, that she told people that she knew that he wrote it because she sat beside him and watched him do it, and that he used her as a sounding board. He wanted to know her reaction to the farewell address as he was writing it. So it does seem in at least that specific instance that we have evidence that she was giving him feedback and advice and that he was taking it. And then when you put that together with finding some documents in her hand and some other pieces of evidence that seem to suggest that she was involved, present, helping to facilitate some of his political relationships, certainly serving as a hostess in political situations, that she was more than just a scribe for him.
Let's talk more about the founding mothers, because I know on your website that you say that you are bringing revolutionary women to life, right? I think I read somewhere that the first signed copy, the advance release copy of My Dear Hamilton, was your 13-year-old daughter wanted it.
Is that
your daughter?
Yes.
Do you feel it's important, especially for her, to see these strong women in such a pivotal time in our nation's history?
I think it's very important, and not just women, but I think it's very important that it's understood that all kinds of people participated in the securing of our independence and the building of our new nation. And certainly that's the stories of the founding mothers, but it's also the stories of free African American people and enslaved people and Native Americans and people of all classes, and that it was an enterprise that was successful because so many people worked for it and supported it. And that's a legacy we all still share today. Real people need to fight for and vote and, serve the country that we all live in today.
I mentioned your daughter wanting an advance copy. Yeah. So I'm curious what the feedback has been, both from her and, well, let's start with her. What did she think?
Her feedback was very, very positive. She was quite mad at us that certain characters died, and I got all kinds of emojis about how mean we were for those deaths. But she really devoured it. I mean, my children and my whole family is a Hamilton family, so there's that. But even as we were doing research and I would share some things that we were finding, they loved it and they were sort of gobbling it up. And that was like parenting wins.
Exactly.
But so the fun thing is that she's told some friends about this novel, and now she's coming home and saying, "Will you sign one of your books for me to give to a friend?" And that's a yes too. Like, go ahead, pass it out. I'm really excited when we have young readers come to the books, because this is their legacy. Like, many of these people, my daughter will be 18 in 4 years, and I want her to understand this is now yours to pick up the mantle for and to carry forward. And so to the extent that our novel, sort of energizes kids along those lines, I think we're very excited about that.
You guys are excited about that, but there's one other person who has your book that you're really excited about too. Tell me, somebody, who is it that has a copy that...
So this is when, when your friends do you really big favors. They do things like manage to help you get an advance copy of your Hamilton book to Lin-Manuel Miranda. We have no idea. He has not said anything. He hasn't reacted. But we are such big fans of the musical that we sort of nerd out just with the knowledge that he has it, that he's maybe looked at it,
that he touched it.
He could have touched it, even if it was like, on the way to the trash can. Like, it doesn't matter. We are, not just jokingly, but really admirers of the historical fiction that he told in the musical. And we don't make all the same narrative choices, but it's because we're telling Eliza's story and he was telling Alexander's story. So we look at it as storytelling, and we sort of broke it down. And just once again, our conclusion was Lin-Manuel Miranda is a genius.
He is. Anytime there was at least one incident where we thought, well, we should do something a little different here. He skipped over the Confederacy years and the Adams administration, and wouldn't it be fascinating for us to explore that? Well, we did, and then we had to cut it out because he was correct. It takes up a lot of space, and it did not do what we hoped it would do.
Many times,
Yes.
Stephanie cursed the Adams administration when we were working on those sections, and then we just sort of joked, like, can't we just have a page where it says, and then it's the Adams administration, and then done.
If we could sing it would be great.
Is there anything you'd like to tell Mr. Miranda about your book, or that if he wants to discuss it, or with you'd be open to that, I'm sure.
Yeah, call us. I don't.
We will take your call.
Yes, we will.
Night or day.
In all seriousness, what I would say is thank you for what he's done for this period of American history, because he's brought all kinds of renewed attention and excitement and accessibility to it, and that I think is really important in terms of a civic service that this musical has ended up performing, but certainly in terms of making the consumers of the musical, and hopefully our books too, good citizens, right? Good stewards of this nation.
Let's talk a little bit. You mentioned cutting. So I think I read somewhere that your first draft was really long, right?
Yes.
So, were there some pieces, you just mentioned the Adams, but were there other pieces that you're like, oh, I wish we could have included that, or anything that you're like, oh, it really hurt to see that section go?
So many.
So many.
So many of those.
I believe we had almost 60,000 words of deleted scenes. We do give them away to our readers on our newsletter. So if people subscribe to our newsletter, we'll be giving them some of the deleted scenes as extras, sort of like a director's cut.
We also put together a little book for people who early on got My Dear Hamilton that we're thinking of expanding, which has, I think the current version of it has 10 deleted scenes, and then we're going to expand and add some more to it. But there were a lot that were very painful to cut, a lot of darlings, and is what you say in the writing world is cut your darlings well. We cut a lot of darlings, I would just want to say. And for me, in this novel, there were probably 2 or 3 scenes that were the hardest for me. One was towards the end of her life, Eliza has dinner at the White House with President Polk and his wife. Mm-hmm. And I just thought that was a delightful scene for a lot of reasons, including that the Polks are not... They're just interesting people. I'll leave it at that. But it was one that ended up going. That whole scene went. And then there's another really delightful scene where during their honeymoon, after they get married at her father's home in Albany, that a whole bunch of French soldiers descend on the Schuyler mansion, and they stay for like 2 weeks. And there are all kinds of interesting scenes. We wrote some of that in. And then it too also needed to go, and I regretted that because the Frenchmen were so delightful.
You had to get rid of your Frenchmen.
I had to get rid of all these awesome Frenchmen. How about for you?
I think we had a great scene with Eliza Schuyler Hamilton confronting Abigail Adams. Oh. And we thought that was great because we have, 2 founding mothers having a spat, as their husbands, of course, are having a spat. And it was great and it was dramatic, but ultimately, it was the Adams administration. It had to go.
And for many months, we had a whole other prologue at the beginning of the book. We imagined Eliza potentially going to Weehawken, to the scene of her husband's demise. And it was part of a whole other story we were going to try to tell about Eliza's life. And ultimately, that had to go, and it was hard because we were pretty big fans of that prologue, and it just wasn't the right frame in the end.
So I'm kind of picking up on what sections you each wrote by what you loved a little bit.
I think we can reveal the scenes that we wrote that we cut, but as the ones that we kept, our hands were on all of those scenes. We generally will draft different chapters and then exchange them and then edit freely. So our words are all interspersed in the document. So there's really no page of the book that both of our hands were not on.
It's so interesting because I feel like you guys must have similar writing styles, because I never could tell that there are two authors on this, because I think it's fascinating. We've never done an interview with co-authors. So I think that dynamic is very interesting. So you guys work obviously very well together. And do you feel like you have a similar writing voice? A writing style?
No, I think the answer to that is no. I mean,
interesting.
It's one of our favorite compliments that people can't tell that there's more than one author, because they shouldn't be able to tell. That was our goal, to make a seamless voice that's just Eliza's story. Right. In our other writing, I would actually say that we have kind of dissimilar styles. Yes. And when we first agreed to co-author America's First Daughter, our first novel, it could have all gone wrong. Like we had never collaborated with each other. We had never collaborated with other people. So it was sort of with a great deal of hubris that we dove into this, and it's sort of magically, and we often sort of say it was magical. It was. It all worked out. We have identified that in some areas Stephanie is stronger, in other areas I'm stronger, and we have complementary strengths. And so when we both go through all the pages, we get to build each other up and build the story up with what our respective strengths are. And it's worked. So we did it a second time. Yeah. We survived it a second time. We did. And we're co-authoring another book right now. So I think we've got it down to a little bit of a science at this point. Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about what you're working on right now.
We are working now on a book about the French Revolution, or rather the women of the French Revolution. This time we're each taking different characters. My character is Sophie de Grouchy-Condorcet, one of the Western world's earliest feminists, and she was a philosopher, and she and her husband were great admirers of the American Revolution and very good friends with many American revolutionaries, including Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, and lots of other figures who had convinced them that our revolution was just fantastic and it should be emulated throughout the world. Advice they took to heart in helping to kick off the French Revolution, which was going to be just fantastic for everyone until it wasn't.
Right.
And my character in that book is a young woman named Emily de St. Amaranth, and her claim to fame was that she died at the height of the Reign of Terror, which was when the French Revolution was guillotining pretty much everyone, including, by the end, its own leaders. But her death in what was a mass execution of like 53 people helped to turn popular opinion against the radical government that was in charge of the Reign of Terror. We are writing these revolutionary women, and the crossovers we have found in both of these books between the American and the French Revolution were many more than I think most of us have a concept of today. And so this is sort of a natural transition for us, although we have other American projects that we'll be working on as well.
I was going to ask, there has to be another founding mother that you're looking at and saying, she's got a pretty good story.
But we can't talk about it now.
To keep the anticipation from killing us, at least we now have these two novels from this writing duo, giving us a whole new perspective on history from the eyes of our intrepid founding mothers.